One of the debated texts between early and late Exodus daters is Jephthah's war with the Ammonites because he mentions Israel had been in the country for 300 years. Now, be careful. It's the Ammonites, not the Amorites. The Ammonites are the descendants of Lot. An Old Testament professor insisted in a debate on the wrong letter. Dr. Falk from ancient Egypt and the Bible tried to correct him, but he wouldn't budge. A while back, Dr. Falk, a firm supporter of the Ramesside Exodus, released a video on why he thinks Jephthah gets multiple things wrong. I encourage you to watch it. I'll put a link to it. My understanding of Jephthah's 300 years is different, but feel free to decide for yourself. Let the arguments begin. Before the Battle of Judges 11 takes place, there is a diplomatic exchange in which Jephthah tries to avoid the war. In this exchange, Jephthah states that it's been 300 years since the Israelites controlled Gilead, that is the Israelite territory east of the Jordan. Late daters like Kenneth, James Hoffmeier, and David Falk say Jephthah's 300 years cannot be considered reliable information. Early daters see in his statement support for their Exodus date. So, is Jephthah a reliable witness? First of all, we need to determine what we mean by reliable. Morally or factually reliable? Morally, the text is clear about Jephthah. The guy is a thug. His origins are shadowed by his mother's occupation. Still, his father seems to be part of a prominent Gileadite family. He is sent away by his brothers and ends up leading a band of thieves and thugs. His vow to sacrifice whoever comes his way first after the victory is obviously a foolish decision in his desire to plead with God to spare his life. Morally, Jephthah is as corrupt as the times he lived in. But does that mean he isn't factually reliable? A bad person can be factually correct. Very bad people can make factually correct assessments. That doesn't mean we agree with what they support or do. Jephthah wasn't asked to lead the Gileadites because he had high morals, but because he was perceived as being militarily effective. He knew how to gather men around him and lead them to victory. We see that he's a great negotiator from verse 4 through 11. The Gileadites ask him to come lead the army in the battle against the Ammonites because they don't have anyone willing to do it. He cunningly negotiates to be named lifetime leader if he manages to lead them to victory. He certainly knows how to get a bargain. This, in turn, will wash his reputation among his own people after his brothers send him away. The question remains, is our judge factually correct or not? I agree with Dr. Falk and Kenneth that not every recorded speech in the Bible is automatically true. The authors accurately record what certain people said, be it true or not. Let's see some of the main objections Dr. Falk has against Jephthah's diplomatic exchange. Number 1. Jephthah says that Chemosh is the god of the Ammonites. It is well known that Milcom is the god of the Ammonites and Chemosh is the god of the Moabites. Nobody doubts this. There are multiple ways to answer this objection. Some consider this an irony. I don't take that route. Late daters say Jephthah is simply wrong because he is, how to put it, ignorant and stupid. After all, he is the son of a prostitute. He's just an uneducated thug. The problem is much more complex than to simply put it on Jephthah's ignorance. The Ammonites were part of the Edomites. These were the sons of the east, mostly the other descendants of Abraham. He had 6 other sons with Keturah plus Ishmael with Hagar. Among the other sons of Abraham were also included Edom, Isaac's other son, and the sons of Lot, Moab, and Ammon. Lot, Abraham's nephew, was given the status of an adopted son since his descendants were located among the Easterners. The Edomites are mentioned many times in the Old Testament. Job was one of them. See my video on him and the Edomites. The lines between the Edomites were gray. Sometimes they were friends, sometimes they were foes. Generally speaking, as we look through the centuries, the strongest among them were the Moabites. Sure, there were times when one group was weak and in a few generations they were strong. At the time of the Exodus, the Edomites and the Moabites each had a king. See Numbers 20. But the Edomite alliances and leadership are not clear all the time. J.R. Bartlett observes that In the Edomite genealogy of Genesis 36, multiple kings of Edom come from cities that are known to be Moabite. More than that, one of the Edomite kings, Hadad, son of Bered, defeated the Midianites in Moabite territory. It's possible that the Edomites and the Moabites shared at times the same king. Bartlett also argues that the title king might be an Israelite cultural interpretation. Their role in election was probably closer to that of the judges in Israel, since Genesis 36 indicates they came from different cities and had different fathers. This makes it clear they didn't have a monarchy in Edom, at least for a period of time. In the book of Judges, the Edomite tribes are mentioned multiple times. In Judges 3, Eglon, the king of Moab, leads an alliance formed of Ammonites, Amalekites, and obviously Moabites. They form together an army that seizes the city of palms, that is Jericho. Parts of Jericho were still standing, only the outside walls were destroyed by Joshua. Years later, the Midianites lead in Judges 6 an alliance formed of Amalekites and other unspecified sons of the east. In Numbers 22, the Moabite king Balak initiates an alliance with the Midianites to attack Israel. The Moabites and the Ammonites make a big alliance against Jehoshaphat in 2 Chronicles 20 in order to attack Judah. As you can see, the lines between the Edomites, their leadership, and the alliances they made periodically are extremely murky. The many different episodes of alliances in very different shapes and sizes prove this. It should be noted that the Moabites are mentioned multiple times in Judges 11. Verse 15, in the very beginning of the diplomatic exchange, states that Israel did not take land from the Moabites or from the Ammonites. Why mention the Moabites if the dispute is with the Ammonites only? Why mention the Moabites first? This would set things on the wrong foot if you start talking about the older brother when you are addressing the younger one. This seems to indicate Jephthah is perceiving the two as one entity. Both tribes, the Moabites and Ammonites, had the same patriarch, Lot. This is a fact. Dr. Falk considers Jephthah's statement a technicality. He references Numbers 21:26 to state the idea that the Moabites took the territory from Ammon, but the text doesn't say that. He can only say this based on Judges 11, assuming the Ammonites' claim to this territory is true. Numbers 21 states King Sihon, the Amorite, watch out for that R, takes the land from the king of Moab. Numbers 21:27 through 30 quotes an Israelite poem that talks about Israel's victory over King Sihon, but it also mentions Moab's past destruction and conquest by King Sihon. Verse 27 alludes to the Israelite victory, and it's an ironical call for the Amorites to come rebuild Sihon's destroyed capital, Heshbon. Verses 28 and 29 summarize Sihon's victory over the Moabite king. This is also stated in verse 26, but here we have a poem saying the same thing. The poem ends in verse 30, reaffirming Israel's strength. It sounds to me like an in-your-face poem because it brags about how strong the Israelites were compared to the Moabites that lost against Sihon. Moab lost to Sihon, Sihon lost to Israel, therefore we are the best. Notice Chemosh is mentioned in verse 29 and that the Israelites stopped their conquest on the border of the Ammonites. This conquest of Moab by Sihon was fairly recent since he is the one defeated by Israel. Nowhere is stated that Ammon was conquered by Moab. That's just an assumption Dr. Falk makes to fit better with his interpretation of Judges 11. Therefore, it was only the Moabite king that could make a claim to the former Moabite territory, and only through Chemosh could they make such a claim. How could that be so if Judges 11 talks about the Ammonites? I encourage you to read the Torah.com article I placed in the video description. Dr. David Cohen proposed 4 options since the Moabites are mentioned multiple times. My interpretation is a slightly different variant of Dr. Cohen's 4th option in the article I mentioned previously. That is, Ammon and Moab were allied tribes that were led by a Moabite king. When Jephthah was negotiating with what the author of Judges calls the king of the Ammonites, this king could have been a Moabite. As I mentioned before, we have multiple examples of a Kedemite king that ruled over two or more related tribes. The Moabites and the Ammonites were closely related through their ancestor Lot. Moab was the firstborn of Lot's older daughter. The Israelites can serve us as an example. Their king was part of one of the 12 tribes, but he led over all or part of the tribes, not just the one he belonged to. This Moabite king was also the king of the Ammonites. We have two related tribes led by the king of the stronger group. He represented them and led them in military campaigns. They accepted his rule as long as he represented their interests. In this case, the Ammonites wanted to conquer Gileadite land because they were the ones bordering Gilead and they had a smaller territory than Moab. The better land was in the northwest, closer to the Jordan, because the desert was in the east. A growing early Iron Age population would create that pressure for sure. The king of the Ammonites, a Moabite, had to diplomatically represent their cause if he wanted to keep them under his rule. Since Jephthah was talking to a Moabite king, he mentioned his God. In such a scenario, this isn't a sample of ignorance, but of cultural appropriation. According to ancient Near East mindset, it was the gods of the kings that gave the strength to control certain territories. The Moabite king was the one ruling over Ammonite land. Therefore, it was his god, Chemosh, that gave him this privilege and could grant him this victory. Ultimately, it was the Moabites that owned that territory before Sihon got it, and then the Israelites got it from Sihon. Therefore, only a Moabite could make such a claim to that land, and thus we can consider the scenario of a Moabite king. The idea of a Moabite king leading the Ammonites is supported by the repeated mentioning of the land of Moab. In the two diplomatic exchanges, Moab is mentioned no less than 7 times. Why would Moab be so present in the discussion if the problem only involved Ammon? Our judge even makes a parallel between the king of the Ammonites and the Moabite king Balak. Here's where we have objection number 2. Jephthah says Moab didn't attack Israel when Balak was king. Dr. Falk states Jephthah is wrong when he says in verse 25 that Balak didn't attack Israel because Joshua 24:9 says he didn't attack Israel. Balak, the son of Zippor, king of Moab, arose and fought against Israel. So, which one is it? Did Balak attack Israel or not? All those invoking this objection need to read the next verse in Joshua 24. Joshua mentions Balak summoning Balaam to come on his 1-mule power-chattering vehicle. He finally makes it to Moab and tries to launch a spiritual attack through which he would convince God to curse Israel. The plan was for Israel to get cursed first and then to launch a military attack together with the Midianites. We can see again the blurry lines of the Kedemite alliances in this alliance between the Moabites and parts of the Midianites. The plan didn't work because God rescued them from the wanted curse of Balaam. I delivered you out of his hand. Joshua 24:10, the very next verse. I delivered you out of his hand makes no sense unless there is an intention to attack them. Numbers 22:6 is very specific in Balak's plan presented to Balaam. Come now, curse this people for me, since they are too mighty for me. Perhaps I shall be able to defeat them and drive them from the land, for I know that he whom you bless is blessed, and he whom you curse is cursed. The plan is as clear as can be. Spiritual attack followed by military attack. But the military attack never happened. The king of Moab changed his strategy once he saw Balaam couldn't curse them. In fact, Israel has the military initiative of attacking Midian in Numbers 31 because it was the Midianite women that tempted their men into idolatry. When Balaam couldn't curse Israel, he advised the Midianites with a different type of spiritual attack. He didn't make it all this way for nothing. His eyes were on the Benjamins. Excuse the intended anachronism. He taught them to seduce the Israelite men through their women to make them worship their idols. This, in turn, would cause God's anger and he would pour his wrath on Israel. You can read this whole episode in Numbers 22 through 25, chapter 31 also. Did Balak launch an attack on Israel? Yes, a spiritual one. Did he launch a military attack? No, because the spiritual one failed, at least initially. In fact, Israel attacks the Midianites in number 31 as a response to this episode. What was Jephthah talking about then? A military attack, not a spiritual one. After all, the enemies were about to launch a military attack against Gilead. The Gileadites are bringing historical arguments that would stop the enemies from attacking them. They are aware that this dispute would continue for a long time if they can convince the Moabites and the Ammonites they didn't take their territory. You either convince your enemy diplomatically or militarily. Keeping the status quo was their aim. Indeed, this dispute lasted for a long period of time until the time of Saul. So far, the purpose of these two objections is just to say something bad about Jephthah. Here comes the most important one, the actual stake for which the first two are raised in the first place from my perspective. Jephthah is wrong that 300 years passed since the Israelite conquest. This objection is not posed as an argument, it's the result of the previous objections. Given that Jephthah is not a morally and factually reliable witness because of the previous objections, his 300-year statement shouldn't be accepted at all, not even as an estimation. Hoffmeier argues the following about this. Jephthah's statement that Israelite tribes had occupied areas of the Transjordan 300 years earlier, since the days of Moses, could be a case of hyperbole, that is, intentionally exaggerating the time in order to strengthen his dispute with the Ammonites. Kenneth hits Jephthah right under the belt when he describes him in the following manner.
Brave fellow that he was, Jephthah was a roughneck, an outcast, and not exactly the kind of man who would scruple first to take a PhD in local chronology at some ancient university of the Yarmouk before making strident claims to the Ammonite ruler. What we have is nothing more than the report of a brave but ignorant man's bold bluster in favor of his people, not a mathematically precise chronological datum. So, it can offer us no practical help. It's in the same class as other statements that biblical writers may well report accurately, but which they would not necessarily expect readers to believe.
I wouldn't hurry in making such harsh and ad hominem attacks. While Jephthah was the son of a prostitute, he grew up with his half-brothers in the same house as his father. Judges 11:2-3 says, when his wife's sons grew up, they drove Jephthah out and said to him, "You shall not have an inheritance in your father's house, for you are the son of another woman." Then Jephthah fled from his brothers and lived in the land of Tob. Verse 7 says he was kicked out of his father's house so he wouldn't get part of the inheritance. It's interesting his half-brothers don't call his mother a harlot. This and the fact he was raised in his father's house means she was taken as a concubine at least, if not a wife, once his father got her pregnant. He received the same education as his brothers. Jephthah would have been as educated as most people of his time, no more, no less. He was possibly the firstborn or one of the first, and he was kicked out when his father died so his half-brothers could get a bigger share of the inheritance. What late daters neglect to mention is that in his diplomatic debate, it's not just Jephthah and the king of the Ammonites that are involved. There are diplomats involved. This series of speeches wasn't delivered by Jephthah in person. Verse 12 states that he sent messengers. There are multiple messengers involved. Jephthah sends messengers again in verse 14. That means multiple brains are involved in this diplomatic exchange. The ignorant Jephthah is not doing this all by himself. When diplomats are sent to carry a message, they are usually picked to be the smartest and the cleverest speakers. In this case, late daters shouldn't deem just Jephthah ignorant and stupid, but all the messengers of Gilead are so. If the smartest Gileadites are to be considered this dumb, imagine how dumb the dumbest are. Of course, I don't believe that, but you can entertain that thought if you want. Maybe Jephthah had a contest of Dumb and Dumber when he picked the diplomats. Maybe he was inspired by Larry from Night at the Museum when he picked his emissaries.
Go! Dum-dum. Yes?
You give me gum gum.
I give you gum gum?
You do dum dum. You give me gum gum.
Gee, okay. You know what? I have no gum gum, sorry. And my name isn't Dum Dum. My name's Larry.
No, your name Dum Dum. Oh, you in trouble, Dum Dum. You better run from Attila the Hun. See you later, Dum Dum.
Watch out for the Ammonites, Jephthah. They're after you. Going back to the serious stuff, according to the late Exodus date, placing Jephthah's diplomatic exchange towards the end of the Judges, they're past, roughly speaking, 150 years since they conquered the Transjordan territories. 200 years would get us in the reign of Saul an impossible matter. Yet, he could have approximated to the closest 100. The number 300 does not have any symbolic or specific meaning in this context. What big difference would it make if he approximated 300 instead of 200? Was 300 years more convincing than 200? I don't think so. Jephthah is really trying his best to avoid this war. He is terrified by it. This is indicated by his vow. Why would he lie? The enemies seem to have the higher ground. Lying or over-exaggerating would compromise his diplomatic endeavor. Diplomacy fails anyway, but the multiple rounds of the discussions indicate the Gileadites were trying hard to avoid the war, while the Ammonites seem very confident they'll win it. 300 years is clearly not an exact number, but only an estimate since it's a round number. It could have been rounded up or down. Given that the Hebrews also used the decimal system, we could say the actual number was somewhere between 250 and 350 years. When it comes to estimates used as an argument, the approximation is most likely higher than the actual number. This means the real number of years could actually be somewhere between 250 and 300 years. Is he rounding up? Most likely. It was and is part of the norms. Modern people do it all the time. Is he using hyperbole? I seriously doubt it. Hyperbole is obvious exaggeration. Had he said 1,000 years, it would have been a hyperbole. If you ask Americans today about the history of their own country, many could probably tell you that the country was founded about 300 years ago. It's an estimate. It doesn't take a PhD to know that, as Kitchen indicates when he mocks Jephthah. Interestingly, Dr. Falk supports the idea that the genealogies of Genesis 5 and 11 are the years of a clan's life, not of individual lives. He believes they were able to record a clan's existence up to almost 1,000 years. Pass it on over periods of thousands of years. Yet Jephthah could not know approximately for how long his ancestors had lived in the country. Right. If we accept the 300 years of Jephthah are an approximation, the chronological case for the late date fails. Late daters rely heavily on ad hominem attacks and Jephthah's failed morals. I'd say all sides can agree about his morals, but it doesn't mean a morally corrupt person is automatically factually incorrect. For the Ramesside theory to stand, Jephthah's 300 years need to be denied. There is no good reason to try and explain away the 300 years unless you are trying to fit it with a certain chronological view. At the same time, it doesn't mean automatically the early date is correct either. Where do I stand? I'm convinced both the early and late Exodus dates get the chronology wrong, and Jephthah's 300 years are an estimate. What do you think? Are the 300 years of Jephthah reliable as an estimate or not? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe. Please hit that like button. It really helps our channel.